Hi everyone, welcome to my channel and to the Rings of Power Final Autopsy Part 2. In Part 1, I talked about the disregard for canon, about the Amazon original characters in the Rings of Power, Grand Elf, the Southlands. So today we're focusing on the other things that we haven't gone over yet. On
Go Galadriel!
the Númenóreans, the Elves, Sauron, and the Dwarves. Get comfy, grab a drink, and let's dive in. Rings of Power Season 2 suffers from many similar problems as Season 1 did. In many ways, this is a natural consequence. What was messed up in Season 1 cannot simply be fixed in Season 2. Mind you, I don't think we saw much desire from the showrunners to fix anything that was criticized after Season 1 anyway. In fact, one could argue that the opposite happened. Let's start with a banger. Galadriel and Elrond's kiss. I was genuinely worried that they would show a flashback of Sauron and Galadriel kissing at some point, or have her get it on with Adar. But the Elrond kiss came out of nowhere. And I'm sure it wasn't surprising only to those who are aware that Elrond is to become Galadriel's son-in-law in the future. Hey, maybe in this universe they're getting rid of Celebrian, Galadriel's daughter. Her husband, Celeborn, the Silver Clam, has been missing since Season 1 anyway, so maybe that's why they're breaking canon. I'm certain this kiss was done purely for shock value because it subverts expectations, and because the writers apparently saw how well House of the Dragon was doing. If you ever need proof that this show has no respect for the original material, this is probably the most obvious and jarring example. Now, since we're on the topic of Galadriel, this character has been butchered beyond recognition. But also, if we just take her as a random, unique character that has nothing to do with Lord of the Rings, she is still a pretty terrible, uninteresting, and annoying character that makes the worst decisions, considering she is a couple thousand years old. And she is probably more of a villain than Sauron is. In Season 1, she got it in her head that Halbrand was king of the Southlands, so she dragged him back to Middle-earth, where he could start wreaking havoc, as Sauron. But Galadriel's biggest offense is that after finding out who Halbrand really is, she didn't tell anyone. Also, Sauron didn't attempt to kill her there and then. He trusted that she would keep his secret, and how right he was. Galadriel, keeping her mouth shut, endangered Calab Rimbor and the whole of Eregion, and if Elrond hadn't put the pieces together and snitched on Galadriel to Gil-Gadadi, all of Middle-earth would be in danger because of one stupid, incredibly stupid elf. If we look at this from Calab Rimbor's perspective, they're making these rings, and the very next moment, this mysterious Halbrand guy, an expert on alloys nonetheless, is gone. Poof, gone. Galadriel comes back and tells Calab Rimbor that she doesn't want him to deal with Halbrand ever again. No further explanation given. And then Elrond, at some point, snatches the rings they just made and gets chased out of Eregion by Galadriel on a horse. What on earth is Calab Rimbor meant to think of all of this? From his POV, this should be weird and suspicious beyond belief. Now, Galadriel knows that these 3 elven rings are completely free of Sauron's influence because she feels it in her heart or something. Now, the messy part is, yes, the 3 elven rings are, if we follow Tolkien's canon, indeed free of Sauron's influence, but that was because they were made later by Calab Rimbor alone. The series has Sauron in his Halbrand form help make them, but somehow that doesn't mean he influenced them and we're just supposed to roll with it. This is just one example of the Rings of Power picking and choosing what they want to take from the source material, but it creates yet another one of 1,000 holes in the fabric that is this story. So the 3 elven rings haven't been tainted with dark magic because, and Galadriel knows this because, she has no real tangible evidence, but, she's incredibly intuitive, except when she's not and doesn't recognize that this is Sauron in disguise. But that aside, Galadriel totally screwed over Calab Rimbor and his city, and yet he still gives her the 9 rings for safekeeping. Galadriel is always right, because the script needs her to be, even at the expense of common sense. Her suspicions always turn out to be true and justified, and other characters are eventually forced to repent for ever doubting her. She can do no wrong, and if she does something wrong, it's not really her fault, it's because she fell victim to deception, and That justifies all her bad decisions after that, even the ones that directly endanger the entire world and everyone in it. There are no consequences for her bad actions. In fact, she usually gets rewarded for them, just like in the last season. And her plot armor is the thickest one out there. She can literally fall from a cliff and survive just fine. Mordania could never. But moving on to Sauron and Calab Rimbor. Sauron, the Master Deceiver, that has whatever power the show needs him to have at any given moment. Sauron that controls everything somehow. We don't exactly know how, but trust us, it's all secretly part of his plan. Even Adar's attack on Eregion was somehow Sauron's plan, even though he needed Eregion to remain standing until the rings were finished. Somehow, he knew that Adar would time the attack perfectly. And even though Sauron could use magic to mind control the guards so that instead of attacking him, they stab themselves, and he could use magic to throw Mordania off the balcony, he apparently couldn't use magic to stop Galadriel from falling or pulling her back up, or even teleport himself down, or even just walk down to her and take the ring. Inconsistent magical powers are inconsistent. Magic. Calab Rimbor, I don't even know what to say here. Calab Rimbor is both deceived enough by Sauron to continue making the rings, yet at the same time he knows he's being deceived. Maybe he's not aware of the full extent of it, but he clearly indicates that he knows Sauron is trying to make him do what Sauron wants. Yet then Calab Rimbor proceeds to finish the rings, but the second they're finished, he attempts to destroy them. And then the fact that he gives them to Galadriel, like I said, the one person who screwed him over the most in this show, it doesn't make any sense, does it? So, moving on to the Numenor storyline, the political situation in Numenor, unsurprisingly, lacks nuance. It's much more complex than Trial by Seaworm, good guys versus bad guys. With mortal characters, and a show that is intended to have at least 5 seasons, they could easily show the passing of time by gradually introducing new characters and have the old ones pass away. But no, everything is happening right here, right now, and we need those name drops for the promo of the show, you see? Speaking of name drops, 1 Durin wasn't enough, so they decided to have 2 because 2 is better than 1. In Khazad-dûm, we have this back and forth between Durin and Durin this season. It feels kind of like a déjà vu. We've seen the Durins fight in season 1, and yes, they had a falling out, which extended into season 2, but now once again they patch things up, they're on good terms, for a few seconds, and bam, the ring enters the picture, and now King Durin is slowly becoming corrupted, and they once again are drifting further and further apart. But just in time, the ring stops clouding King Durin's mind so that father and son can have one final touching moment before the king sacrifices himself to the Balrog. It would be so much more impactful if they started on good terms from season 1, and then when the ring is introduced, it would cause their relationship to deteriorate. This would give the audience both the time to understand the dynamic of Durin and Durin's relationship, get accustomed to it, and for the showrunners and writers to develop that relationship. So their falling out due to the ring would really be a big moment. Instead, we have this back and forth bickering, now we're good, now we're not, now we're good again, oh, but now there's a ring. It does nothing for your emotions as the audience member. The Balrog has got to be one of the worst plot lines in the show. It's Schrodinger's Balrog. It might be alive and dangerous, or it might not be, depending on whether you can see him behind the wall of stone or not. We know that the Balrog is alive and very dangerous because we saw it, but now we can send our troops away because the Balrog is once again buried behind the rocks. Now he can't hurt us because we can't see it. Toddler logic. Also, Durin's ring apparently has selective powers. Encountering a Balrog cancels out the power of the ring, and the person wearing it can think clearly again. Insta-sober. My next point may seem a bit trivial, but the costumes do play an important role in our immersion in the story. I talked about this a lot 2 years ago, and one issue still persists. In this show, all the peoples of Middle-earth, be it men, elves, Numenorians, or dwarves, have no distinctive wardrobe. Everyone is dressed more or less the same. Not exactly the same, but you can hardly tell a Númenórean from an elf. And while you can tell an elf from a dwarf due to their height and facial hair, you probably could not by costume alone. If you put Disa's dress on a tall, thin elf, could you say that this dress is a dwarven dress? Or would it just look like any other elven dress? How are we supposed to believe, for example, that the dwarves who live very isolated and private lives underground became this diverse? And I want to be clear, even though I know there will be people who take my words out of context and lack listening comprehension, but if this were a random fantasy show, not a Tolkien appropriation, and they decided that one subgroup of fictional elves in their fantasy are going to be black, or that one subgroup of dwarves that live in a particular area are going to be East Asian, that could make sense. But mixing everything together, race-wise, appearance-wise, hairstyle-wise, costume-wise, it just breaks the audience immersion. If everyone looks the same, no one looks like they belong to a particular group, to a particular people. Game of Thrones was able to do this right. The diversity was believable and it didn't feel forced because people from different parts of Westeros looked a certain way, dressed in a certain way, had specific customs and costumes, whereas people that came from Essos, again, looked differently, dressed differently, behaved differently, had different customs. And that made more sense. But not only that, it made the world feel bigger and richer. Something that, ironically, the world as big as Middle-earth lacks immensely in the Rings of Power. So, I guess that's it for this video. Thank you very much for your time. For one of my future videos, I'm probably going to be revisiting House of the Dragon, and for Halloween, I'll try to put something together. Let me know if there is something you'd like me to talk about. Until I see you again, take care, and never forget.
The sea is always right!
The sea is always right!